The 10 Plagues of Egypt from the Bible. God's purpose in sending the 10 plagues on Egypt was to convince Pharaoh to set the Hebrews free and allow them to go and worship God. Unfortunately, Pharaoh did not set the Hebrews free, and Egypt suffered extreme devastation from the 10 plagues. Not much was left in Egypt after the plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea. The Egyptians had lost their army, crops, cattle, and even their firstborn children. The 10 plagues can be found in the Bible from the book of Exodus, chapter 7, verse 14, through Exodus, chapter 12, verse 36. First plague. The water turns to blood. The first plague of Egypt, known as water turns to blood. This plague had devastating consequences for the Egyptian civilization, as the Nile was a vital source of water and livelihood for the country. The blood-contaminated water caused the death of fish and other aquatic creatures, affecting the food chain and the economy. Furthermore, it became impossible for the Egyptians to drink water or use it for irrigation, leading to widespread shortages. Despite the efforts of the Egyptian magicians to replicate this miracle, they were unable to reverse the plague. Second plague. Frog plague. The second plague of Egypt, known as the plague of frogs. The plague began when Aaron, the brother of Moses, stretched out his hand over the rivers, canals, and pools of Egypt, and thousands of frogs invaded the land. These amphibians multiplied rapidly, filling all the inhabited areas of the country. The frogs found their way into homes, into people's beds, and even into their ovens and food containers. It was impossible to escape from them. Pharaoh, faced with the discomfort and destruction caused by the frogs, sought help from Moses and Aaron. He promised to free the Hebrews if the plague was gone. Moses, acting as the intermediary between Pharaoh and God, asked Pharaoh to decide when he wanted the frogs to leave. Pharaoh replied, "Tomorrow," hoping to buy time and hold off the Hebrews. However, when the frogs disappeared the next day, Pharaoh reneged on his promise and hardened his heart. This led to the continuation of the plagues in Egypt as part of the divine plan to persuade Pharaoh to release the Hebrew people. Third plague. Lice plague. The third plague of Egypt, known as the plague of lice. The plague of lice was characterized by the sudden infestation of lice in men and animals alike. It is said that Moses stretched out his rod and struck the dust of the ground, causing it to turn into swarms of lice that covered the entire country. The lice attached themselves to people and animals, causing itching, irritation, and discomfort. This plague was particularly distressing to the Egyptians, as lice were considered unclean and infestation was a symbol of degradation and humiliation. Although Pharaoh's magicians tried to replicate Moses' miracle, they were unable to do so, leading some of them to acknowledge divine authority behind the plagues. Despite the suffering caused by the plague of lice, Pharaoh continued to harden his heart and refused to release the Israelites. Fourth plague. Plague of flies. The fourth plague of Egypt, known as the plague of flies. The plague of flies was unleashed on Egypt after Pharaoh once again refused to let the Israelites go. The flies invaded the entire country, infesting homes, fields, and temples. There were so many that it was impossible to escape from them. Flies were a source of nuisance and pollution, and their constant presence affected daily life and the economy of ancient Egypt. This plague had a significant impact on Egyptian society, as flies were considered unclean and associated with corruption and poor hygiene. The plague affected agriculture, as the flies damaged crops and livestock. In addition, they interrupted religious and sacrificial practices, since they perched on altars and contaminated rituals. Fifth plague. Cattle plague. The fifth plague of Egypt, known as the cattle plague. The cattle plague was characterized by the mass death of domesticated animals in Egypt, including cattle, cows, horses, donkeys, and sheep. These animals were vital to the economy and daily life of ancient Egypt, as they provided food, transportation, and labor. The plague began with the sudden death of animals, which were afflicted with a mysterious disease or plague. The animals sickened and died in large numbers, causing economic devastation and a loss of resources for the Egyptian people. Despite the calamity affecting Egypt, Pharaoh continued to refuse to release the Israelites. Sixth plague. The plague of ulcers. The sixth plague of Egypt, known as the plague of ulcers. The plague of ulcers was characterized by the appearance of painful sores and ulcers on the skin of Egyptians and cattle. These injuries were so severe that they caused intense suffering and discomfort. The Egyptians tried to ease their pain, but could not find any solution. Throughout the narrative, it is mentioned that Moses, who was the leader of the people of Israel, was instructed by God to warn Pharaoh about the consequences of his refusal to release the Hebrews. However, Pharaoh continued to harden his heart and he refused to budge. The plague of ulcers was one of the most shocking and painful plagues suffered by the Egyptians. This plague served as a demonstration of divine power and God's wrath towards the oppression of the people of Israel. Seventh plague. Hail plague. The seventh plague of Egypt, known as the plague of hail. According to the story, Moses warned Pharaoh of the imminent arrival of a devastating hailstorm. However, Pharaoh dismissed the warning and once again refused to release the Israelites. As a result, a hailstorm struck the land of Egypt, destroying crops, livestock, and anything left out in the open. This plague was especially devastating because Egypt was heavily dependent on agriculture. The hail destroyed the fields, ruining the crops and causing famine. Only in the Gosen region, where the Israelites lived, no hail fell, which was an obvious sign of divine protection. Finally, Pharaoh recognized the strength and wrath of God after witnessing the destruction caused by the plague of hail. He momentarily repented and promised to free the Israelites. However, once the storm subsided, Pharaoh hardened his heart again and refused to keep his word. Eighth plague. Plague of locusts. The eighth plague of Egypt, known as the plague of the locusts. The locust plague is described as a massive invasion of these voracious insects that wiped out crops and plantations in Egypt. Locusts are known for their ability to destroy vast areas of vegetation in a short time due to their sheer numbers and insatiable appetite. They feed on leaves, shoots, and stems of plants, leaving behind a desolate landscape. The arrival of the locusts was a devastating blow to the Egyptian economy, as agriculture was the main source of livelihood at the time. Plantations of wheat, barley, and other essential crops were completely destroyed, leading to food shortages and a serious crisis in the country. Despite Pharaoh's attempts to stop the plague, such as asking Moses and Aaron for help, the locusts persisted and covered the entire country, darkening the sky with their presence. The plague only stopped when God removed the locusts after the intervention of Moses. Ninth plague. Plague of darkness. The ninth plague of Egypt, known as the plague of darkness. During this plague, a thick darkness covered the entire land of Egypt for 3 days. This darkness was so thick that people could not see or move, and no ray of light penetrated their homes. However, the Israelites had light in their places of residence. This plague had a devastating impact on the daily lives of the Egyptians, as daily activities were disrupted. The total darkness generated a feeling of fear and despair in the population, since they could not do anything until the plague finally dissipated. Pharaoh, after enduring the previous 9 plagues, finally relented and agreed to release the Israelites. However, after the darkness disappeared, he changed his mind again and went after the Israelites once more, leading to the last and most dramatic plague. 10th Plague. Plague of the death of the firstborn. The last plague of Egypt, known as the plague of the death of the firstborn. This plague was the 10th and most devastating of all the plagues sent by God to free the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. The plague of the death of the firstborn occurred during the night. According to Moses' warning, God was going to go through Egypt and kill all the firstborn, from the firstborn of men to the firstborn of animals. However, the Israelites would receive protection if they marked the doors of their houses with the blood of a sacrificed lamb. When night came, the angel of death passed through all of Egypt and killed the firstborn in every home, from the children of the pharaohs to those of slaves and animals. However, the houses of the Israelites marked with the blood of the lamb were bypassed and their firstborn were spared. The plague of the death of the firstborn was a traumatic and devastating event for ancient Egypt, since it affected all families without exception. After this plague, Pharaoh finally freed the Israelites and allowed them out of Egypt, ending their slavery.